returning who were at the first talk, and special welcome to those who are joining for the first time. And they don't need to worry because the talks are fairly self-contained. And special welcome to Mare, who's tuning in from Skopje in North Macedonia. I think that's a record for me. So that's wonderful. Just before I start talking about the subject tonight, just a quick word about Conservation 50. The speaker's fee is going to Conservation 50, and you may remember it was set up in 2019 to mark 50 years of conservation area in St Albans. It hasn't given up though, and it's got more projects. And just to let you know that the contributions you're making tonight will be going towards the Blue Plaque scheme for St Albans, to clean up the alleyways and so on. So it's still a very active group. Enough of that. I'm going to share my screen with you now. Start the slideshow. Now, I hope everybody can hear and see okay. If you've got a problem, do let Kate know. Well, tonight we're moving to the second series in these Origins of Western Art, and I'm going to take us through from the medieval period to Renaissance. As I mentioned last time, it's an immensely ambitious project, so I will be very selective and probably going at a bit of a breakneck speed, so I hope I'm not going to go too fast. Now, I'm just taking us back to where we left off at the first talk. I covered right really from cave art right the way up to the late Roman Empire. And one of the last images I showed was the image on the right, which is this huge colossus head of Constantine, which was found in the basilica of his rival, Maxentius's basilica, who he had defeated in civil war. And then on the left, we have the founder of the empire, the Emperor Augustus. And I just want you to look at the difference in the styles between those two. We had reached the classical world in the last talk, and we saw how naturalistic, but also how idealized it was. And if you look at Augustus there, on the left, you can see this is a very idealized young man, even though this sculpture was probably made after his death. And of course, why he's shown as a young man is he wants to be remembered as young and vigorous, and it has elements of reality. So it is a portrait, but also it is an idealization, because he wants to be seen as this magnificent Roman emperor, fully in control, and unlike some of us, I include myself here, not losing any faculties as we age. On the other side, we have Constantine. Now, what a difference we see in the style. This is a very stylized sculpture with these penetrating eyes and almost schematic hairstyle, nose and mouth. So we've moved from something that was relatively realistic, but certainly idealized and naturalistic, to something that is much more almost transcendental. And what we're going to see in the switch from the ancient world to the medieval world is what I think Gombrich described, and many of you will know, great art historian Ernest Gombrich, described as art that is not about seeing, but about knowing. And what he meant by that was that when we look at Constantine, we know what he stands for, the concept of Constantine, a fierce, powerful ruler who is looking over us. And of course, it's during the reign of Constantine that Christianity becomes the dominant religion in the empire, eventually to become the sole religion and shape Christian Europe and the Christian world. So an immensely important figure. Now, I mentioned that Constantine came to power through civil war, and he famously defeated his rival Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 311. And almost immediately, he had a triumphal arch put up. Now, this arch is full of interest and some bafflement for art historians. I think he was in such a hurry to assert his power in Rome that what he did was he borrowed lots of other bits of art. So we have up here at the top, if you can see the cursor up here, right at the top running across, we have panels art, which actually are not done in Constantine's time at all. They come from the period of Antoninus Pius. And if we go further around here, these sculptures on the end, these are from the time of the Emperor Hadrian. So what he's doing, the Emperor Trajan, what he's doing is borrowing works of art. And finally, these roundels, you can see the roundels here and here, over this side, these are from the Emperor Hadrian. And only just down below here, a frieze, and on this side, another frieze, and of course, on both sides of the arch, are sculptures from the time of Constantine himself. So when we look at them close up, you'll see a tremendous difference in artistic styles. If we start over here on the left, we've got the sacrifice to Apollo by the Emperor Hadrian, and he's out hunting. And many art historians think that probably these roundels came from his hunting lodge. But below, we have here the Emperor Constantine, and his part here is missing. He is speaking to the citizens of Rome. And over this side, the contrast is even more dramatic, isn't it? Here we've got Hadrian, and there's a lion. You probably can't see it very well there, but he's standing on a dead lion from the lion hunt. And then over here, he's sacrificing to Hercules in gratitude for the success of his hunt. So that's all the time from Hadrian. And what we're talking about there is the 2nd century. And down here, we've got the contemporary work of art with Constantine. And here, the close-up, you can get an idea of what's going on. What Constantine is doing is handing out money to the citizens of Rome. It's liberalitas. He's giving away a bribe, essentially, of the emperor. And look at how schematic and unnaturalistic the figures are. They're almost dwarfish here. The togas are just shown by really just lines rather than any modeling. And the heads, of course, are much larger. So what is going on here? Initially, when art historians thought, they saw this, they thought possibly the skill workshops in Rome had closed down because of the war, and therefore this was really poor craftsmanship. And of course, there may be an element of that in these works of art. However, the style is very different, and Constantine is on the cusp of adopting Christianity. And this rather more popular, and you might almost describe it as primitive style, is very much connected to the early Christian works of art that we find, which are not state-sponsored. Therefore, the artists are not the top, very expensive artists or the most skilled, but people are putting together a story. And in this case, the story is, of course, of the success of Constantine and his power. Now, during this period, the late Roman Empire, down through Constantine, the Roman world was under attack. Essentially, what the Romans called barbarians, mainly Germanic peoples, were entering the empire. And this map shows what's going to happen to the empire and lead us into the medieval period. You can see here these arrows. Let's just take England, for example, the Angles and the Saxons. And we're not sure how much was invasion and how much was actually settlement by the Romans needing support, particularly for their armed forces from the Germans. But we do know, of course, that the Vandals came all the way through what is France now, down through the province of Spain, into North Africa, and of course completely ravaged North Africa, hence why Vandal has become associated with mindless destruction. And then if we look at the Green Line, we've got the Huns, very destructive, only finally defeated in 451 at Chalons. And then we've also got this purple line here, the Ostrogoths, who go round through Greece, eventually, of course, sacking Rome in 409. So, and finally, I shouldn't forget the Franks, very important later on, because they become the heart, of course, of a new empire, and we'll come back to that later. So the Roman Empire is cracking up in the West. In the East, Eastern Roman Empire continues, now around a new capital, Constantinople, founded by Constantine himself, of course, and taking away the seat of power really from Rome. So that's the political situation. And I put in a sort of time chart here. Now, I don't want you to get too worried about what's going on down the bottom. I want you just to look to start with at this area here, the Byzantine Empire. Well, they call themselves Romans, and they call themselves Romans even though their main language moved from Latin to Greek. The first time Byzantium gets coined as a term is actually in the 16th century by the German historian Hieronymus Wolff, and it's become a very convenient label. And we now talk about Byzantium, the empire of Byzantium, based around Constantinople, the East Roman Empire, and we talk about Byzantine things. And what I'm going to show you is some areas of Byzantine art, and I'm going to start with three here, Santa Maria Maggiore and San Vitale, and then later on we'll come to some more Byzantine art in the talk. And in terms of historical interest, of course, we've got Justinian restoring partly the Roman Empire, and we'll see that's quite important in the West when he comes to Italy. The Papal Rome gets founded, and then very importantly, of course, in the Middle East, the birth of Islam and the overrunning of many of the Byzantine territories, Palestine, Syria, and eventually Egypt, and finally North Africa, by the Muslim conquests. I'm just having slightly difficulty moving the slide on. Sometimes they do get a bit stuck, and I think that's what I've got now. Don't you love technology? The one good thing about joining this evening is you didn't have to go out in the wind. We've moved on. Good. That was a bit tricky. Sorry about that. I'm just outlining here what are the characteristics to look for in medieval art. And we've already seen from the Arch of Constantine a simplification and something that's very stylized. The whole idea of spatial depth and perspective and modeling tends to disappear, and proportion and function are also overridden by a more political aspect, which is linked to religion. So it becomes very much based on Christianity and the Christian religion. It's spiritual, quite metaphysical, because it's in a way taking people away from this earth and transporting them into a heavenly environment. And it's also therefore very hieratic and transcendental. And we'll see that many of the figures confront us frontally, so we engage with them as if they are indeed in another world, separate from us, their physicality lightened. Now, our first example of some Byzantine influence and late Roman influence is this mosaic from the Basilica di Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, dated around about to 434, the work of two popes, Celestine and Sixtus III, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And this is a tiny little bit of the mosaic, and some of you probably have been to Rome and seen that the mosaics are quite considerable, quite marvelous. And this little mosaic shows Herod, King Herod, greeting the wives, or in fact ordering, of course, the destruction, the massacre of the innocents. But it's a story, and we know that from our early Christian writings at this period, the clergy were urging the churches to be decorated with stories which helped people understand the faith. And of course, we recognize that at that time, not a lot of people were literate. So the stories, the visual stories, were very powerful in telling the Christian story. So the story here has become much more important than the aesthetic of the art, or if we might say the reality of the art. So Herod is shown as a large figure here. Interestingly enough, he is given a halo which later becomes just reserved for Christian martyrs and saints, but at this time was a recognition of the fact that he was a king. And here are the soldiers and military soldiers, and this soldier right at the front showing that this was a massacre conducted by the military. And then the women with their children, the babies here, and just a little row of heads going right the way to the back. But notice the wonderful colors of the mosaic and how vibrant and lively it is in telling the story. Still having trouble, I'm afraid, with moving the slide on. There we are. That's better. We're now moving to Ravenna, right up in the northeast of Italy. And some of you, no doubt, will have been to Ravenna and seen the most amazing mosaics, Byzantine mosaics, probably installed after, well, most certainly installed after the reconquest of parts of Italy by the Emperor Justinian. And right in the choir of the Church of San Vitale, high up, are two mosaics facing each other. On one side, we have the Emperor Justinian. And here he is. And notice how he's in front of everybody, wearing the purple cloak of the emperor with wonderful gold weaving here, facing us, staring at us, demanding our honor and, in a sense, our submission to him.
Oh, sorry to interrupt him. Just to say that the slide hasn't moved on for us, so we're not seeing what you're describing.
Oh dear, I may. Would your control be better, Kate?
Yes, I'll see if I can. I'll share your PowerPoint now.
Yes, and I might just ask you to move the slides on. This does happen, I'm afraid, and I remember it happening last time. I think I had to ask Caroline to take control.
No worries. I'll just get your.
So you've missed. Have you just missed Justinian?
Yes, I think it was just Justinian.
Right. So I was talking enthusiastically about something you couldn't see.
No worries. I will just, if I ask you to stop sharing, Tim, and I'll share my screen.
Yes, I'll stop sharing. I think that's much better.
There we are.
Oh yes, and I've heard that there's some people still trying to get in, Kate.
Have email.
Oh.
Link.
Ah.
Like Sophia.
Is there an email link they can pick up, or there should be?
Yes, so they should be, if anyone's having trouble and they've left the meeting, they should be able to get in straight by the link that they had in the welcome email.
I think this person didn't get the email, I'm being told, but
Right. I will sort that out, and in the
Thanks,
meantime,
Kate.
I'll let him take on.
I'll get back to Justinian. So what I was saying, here we are, Justinian. As I say, out in the front, you can see that. Oh, he's got his purple boots on, of course. Purple was the imperial color. So here he is emperor with consuls who also have purple stripes. And of course, he's with Maximian, the deacon of the church, and two of his assistants with the Bible and a censer. And Justinian himself is holding a bowl. And we'll see when we go to the other side, this is clearly because he's part of the Eucharist. And in there would be the Eucharistic bread. And over here, very interestingly in the way that they are shown us, is his Gothic bodyguard. Germans, we can tell because they're wearing these torques, their hairstyles are rather different, and they have on the shield in front the Chi Rho of Christos, Christ. And you may remember that Constantine had the Chi Rho put on his shields before his battle against Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge. And this was from a sign in the heavens. So this magnificent mosaic, a lot of gold, leaf and gold, and Justinian showing his power. And historians tend to refer to this period as it being Caesaro-Papist, because not only does the emperor claim to be God's representative on earth, he also claims to be the conduit through which his subjects can reach God. The Byzantine emperor, in other words, becomes the vicar of God, and that in some senses creates a tension, of course, with the Pope, who is dominant in the West where there is no longer a Roman emperor. So there is already a schematic sense being built between East and West, between the Orthodox Church in the East and the Roman Catholic Church in the West. Could I have the next slide then, please, Kate? And here we are. And on the other side of the choir is the Empress Theodora. And you can see, oh, I seem to have lost her. Ah, there we are. I've got her back. Technology playing up a bit. You can see how richly dressed she is again in purple as the Empress. And down here, interestingly, embroidered, I mean, amazing piece of mosaic work, are the three wise men coming to offer presents to Christ the child. And here we have her ladies in waiting, all beautifully dressed and wonderful patterns on their dress. And here two of her attendants, possibly even eunuchs, because by this time the palace was beginning to castrate any males who served the empresses or their family. And over here we have a little fountain. So two amazing mosaics, but notice what the emphasis is on. They face us frontally. Their richness is demonstrated to us. There's little perspective, a little bit of perspective, but little perspective, and we are in awe of them. So they are literally awesome to us. So that's the Byzantine development, and we see that throughout Byzantine history and Byzantine art. It is this hieratic theological approach to art that's important. So going back to what Gombrich said, what you can see by knowing here is really the concept of Christianity and the position of the emperor and others within the Christian faith that is important, not a realistic or naturalistic representation. Next slide, please. So we've dealt here the first bit of Byzantium, and I want to move us now to the Middle Ages here. And this is really interesting when we get a real intermix of art. We're going to look at a bit of Anglo-Saxon Celtic work, Sutton Hoo and the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Kells and the Gospels of Aachen, the Aachen Gospels. So we're going to look at those. What's going on historically? The Anglo-Saxon settlement, of course, and Sutton Hoo is an Anglo-Saxon burial. Viking raids, which took up a lot of that early period struggle over who was going to control England. And then Charlemagne, who becomes crowned as Holy Roman Emperor in 800. We're going to deal with that. And then we'll come back later to look at the Romanesque and Gothic. Next slide, please. So let's have a look at what was happening in the so-called barbarian art. Here we are at Sutton Hoo, a wonderful purse, a purse lid, a wonderful piece of craftsmanship, a cloisonné with garnets and gold. And of course, Sutton Hoo has been quite strong in popular entertainment recently, because some of you will have seen the film The Dig, where Edith Pettit, who owned the land and commissioned Basil Brown to do the excavation, featured with Ralph Fiennes and Carey Mulligan playing those two parts. So The Dig has reopened a lot of interest, I think, in Sutton Hoo. A burial ship, quite unique and special, and with wonderful treasures. A purse lid being perhaps the prize, but also the great buckle down here, wonderful buckle, gold buckle, and these animals intertwined. They call them ribbon animals with, I don't know if you can just see the head there of one, and over here a head again. Wonderful intertwining of knots, which we associate quite often with not just Anglo-Saxon art, but also with Celtic art. So this art is going to have an influence also on what happens in Western medieval art. It gets integrated and adopted into it. Next slide, please. And of course, one of the great legacies that passed down are the manuscripts of the Celtic Church. Those Christians who survived the initial pagan onslaught, particularly of the Vikings, but also, of course, of the Anglo-Saxons, who were converted, of course, not or were converted, I should say, by Augustine, not the Augustine of Hippo, but the Augustine of Canterbury. But this Celtic art, Lindisfarne here, right up on the coast of Northumbria, and I'm sure many of you have been, quite a romantic and wonderful place. The Lindisfarne Gospels in the 8th century, now in the British Library. And this is one of the carpet leaves, and very intricate patterning, wonderful patterning, which we associate with Celtic art. And then on this side, the Book of Kells, now in the Trinity College, Dublin. This is Christ here, holding the Gospels. Quite interesting outlines of basic figurative drawing, but then when we look at the decoration, circles interwoven and patterning, quite wonderful patterning with birds up here and what seems to be angels with wings, perhaps a seraphim here, figures there. Very intricate works of art with terrific skill demonstrated in elaborating these manuscripts. Next slide, please. And moving on then to Charlemagne, the reign of Charlemagne, and Charlemagne being crowned, as I said, in 800 as Holy Roman Emperor. And so the Holy Roman Empire is formed, which is a sort of counterbalance to the Eastern Roman Empire, but formed with quite different traditions. But what Charlemagne does do at his court is he creates a form of Renaissance, a tiny revival of classicism. Here he is on the left, and his coin, Carolus, quite basic, you might say, in terms of what we're used to with some Roman coinage. And notice he's using the title Emperus, Emperor Augustus, as if that title gives him some sort of extra credibility. So the tradition of the Roman Empire goes on in this coin, silver coin, the silver denier, we think minted between 812 and 814, now in Paris. And then clear marks of this Renaissance, this revival. Here a leaf from the Archon Gospels, and you'll notice we've got the four evangelists here, and this really relates to the revelation of St. John, because they're all given an animal that goes with them, so that we have Matthew and John and Luke and Mark. Mark the lion, of course, who's then going to get adopted, as many of us will know, as the Venetian symbol. If you look at the robes of the evangelists, you can see there is definitely an attempt to try and create the flowing ancient robes. So there's an attempt at some realism in there, but it's still, what's more important, the placing for us to observe these important Christian figures. And then jewelry, some gems are put around the side, and we've got a little bit of landscape and some attempt here at the writing case, and even with the lecterns on which they're writing. So there's an attempt at some revival of classicism at this period. Next slide, please. Now, things started to stabilize with Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire, and we get the formation now of boundaries which eventually, of course, much later, to become national boundaries. So we've got our Byzantine Empire in the east being eaten into by Islam, first of all by Arab armies, and then later by Turkish armies. Over here, though, we've got England and Scotland and Ireland as developed as separate nations. France under the Franks, but of course Charlemagne was a Frank himself. The Holy Roman Empire absorbing Germany and Austria and on to what becomes Poland, and then Hungary developing its own empire through the Magyars. The Papal States here, and down here the Kingdom of Sicily, which was formulated out of Spain, and Portugal was already broken away from Spain. And notice here we have Navarre and Aragon, which are later to be absorbed. And then the northern states up here, Denmark, Sweden and Norway. So this is our medieval world that we're looking at. Next slide, please. So we're in the Middle Ages. Here we are, 500 to 1400. Now, the term medieval, and you may have noticed an inconsistency in that I spelt medieval with a diphthong, A-E, so M-E-D-I-A-E, whereas now perhaps the most popular spelling is leaving out the diphthong altogether and just having an E. And that, in fact, is the spelling that was the cathedral put on the blurb for this particular talk. Sometimes people think that the diphthong is the English spelling and the E is just the American spelling, but it's not quite as simple as that. But the diphthong has got out of favor. Diphthong just means double sound, and it's just two vowels brought together. But the term medieval was first used by Petrarch in the 14th century, and he used it in a derogatory sense. What he was saying was this middle period between the ancient world and the Renaissance was really barbarian and very poor. But of course, it doesn't carry that pejorative connotation anymore. So we've looked at the Carolingian Renaissance. We're now going to look at the two main artistic styles of the medieval period. And that is the Romanesque, and the name for that is fairly obvious in the sense that it follows what people thought was the Roman style, and then the Gothic, which was again an invention of Italians during the Renaissance time who thought the Middle Ages was barbaric, and they associated the Goths, a German tribe, with those. So it's funny how Gothic has taken on various different dark meanings. But of course, there's no nuance with the architecture. We just think of it as a different architectural style, and we'll come on to that. And we're going to look at a church in Arles, Saint-Trophime, which I'll tell you a little story about that association. Chartres, perhaps the most famous of the Gothic churches. And that will bring us on to some English art, which of course was the first slide, the Wilton diptych. And we're going to finish with, not actually in this group, but we will look at Simone Martini and what is called the International Gothic. While this is going on, we've got the Saxon settlement, the Viking raids, and we're moving down to Charlemagne, the Battle of Hastings. Oh, Kate, am I being heard all right, or is there some sound problem?
Yes, I can hear you. Well, I think your computer is making a noise which is coming through, but it's not hugely disruptive, so you can be heard quite clearly by me. I don't know if anyone else is.
Oh, it's actually my computer, is it?
I can hear I heard a slight background noise. It sounded like a computer, but I wasn't sure.
Do you think it might be the fan on the computer or something like that?
Yes, that's what it sounded like. But
I do apologize for that. Sometimes I know that microphones can pick up fan sounds.
It does appear to be gone now, actually, so I think it.
So it may be the fan coming on. I do apologise. It may be coming on and off. Oh dear. The technologies give you all this fun, don't they? Anyway, I got to the Battle of Hastings and the Crusades, and then the Black Death, and the 100 Years' War. That's just the historical events that are going on. So next slide, please. Then. And here we are at a typical Romanesque church, the Church of Saint-Trophime in Arles. Built between the 12th and 15th centuries. And I have a little tale to tell about this because many years ago, when I was going to take a party around Roman Provence, and we went to look at Roman archaeological sites, and I did a little bit of scouting. And Arles, of course, has a wonderful amphitheatre, and it has a very interesting Roman cemetery and so on. And so I arrived in Arles in my little Mini. Yes, I can squeeze into a Mini, or could in those days anyway. And I parked my Mini just virtually next door to Saint-Trophime, because the guest house I was staying in is just over to the right of this slide over here. And I parked the Mini there. And the next morning, when I got up, the doors had been forced open. And fortunately, I had virtually nothing. And someone had obviously tried to rob it. I mean, Minis didn't have very secure doors. So that was my welcome to Arles. But I didn't really know anything about the Church of Saint-Trophime at that time because I was really looking at the Roman archaeology. Could I have the next slide, please? This is the tympanum over the door, which you saw in the previous slide. And it reveals really the basics of Romanesque art. And you can see there's a lot of patterning around here, which is egg and dart, classical stuff, taken from classical buildings and copied. And then you have the revelations again. And here is Jesus Christ. Notice two fingers, the Father and Son. That became quite a bit of a dispute with the Orthodox Church. And the symbols of the evangelists. So you've got Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. There they are, surrounding. And you see how there's some element of perspective in the way that Jesus stands out from the surface of the stone, but it's really a pattern, stylized. Look at the way the folds are done on his robe here. They're not really trying to create anything that's realistic, but give you a sense. And the same is also true if you look here at Matthew and the way the animals are done. A Romanesque sculpture wasn't so concerned with proportion or function. It was about putting across a message, a transcendental message, a message of Christianity and of power. And that was the key to the Romanesque art. And we see it in their frescoes, and we see it in their sculpture. Next slide, please. And that merged into a new style called the Gothic. And the Gothic style really was dependent on advances in architecture. If we look here at these two churches from France, the Abbey at La Madeleine at Vézelay and the Cathedral at Rheims, we can get a real sense of the change in style. See, the windows here are rounded. Can everybody see that, I hope, on the cursor? Rounded windows. The arches there are rounded. And over here, you can see they're pointed. Now, this difference in the way the arches were done was very important architecturally, because if you imagine the weight coming down onto this one on the left here, you can see the weight coming down onto the round one. If it comes down onto the round one, it pushes those out. It's called the thrust, and it makes the wall more vulnerable. Whereas here, these pointed ones push the thrust down either side rather than through the center. So that's through the center, these are down the side. And what this means is you can put more windows into your cathedrals, into your buildings, so you get more light, and the Gothic opens up greater opportunities for the architects. And of course, what comes with that is also a development, a wonderful development, and Chartres is a good example, though I'm not going to show you tonight, of stained glass. And so cathedrals become much more lighter, and they can of course become higher because the thrust, the weight, is not so dangerous. It's dissipated, and of course then you get buttresses protecting the sidewalls. So the Gothic leads to great advances in building and changes. Now, going on to the next slide, which is at Chartres, we've got a tympanum in the same way that we had at Saint-Trophime in Arles, but look at the sculpture here, the so-called jamb sculpture. Jamb because they were by the doors, and see how stylized Gothic has become. Just these very tall, very elegant figures, but of course otherworldly, quite transfigural figures, and they're looking down onto us in from another world. They're not part of our world. They're somewhere else, and something, of course, that the church wants us to aspire to, because these are saints, kings and queens who have gone to heaven. They're heavenly creatures, and when we look at them, they're not supposed to look like us. They're supposed to look like us transported, like holy figures transported to another world. And the patterning is quite amazing. If you look at the robes here, the patterning, absolutely, and it has a quality to it. So no one would suggest that these artists didn't have the ability to create great art. What they were doing was creating an art that was not dependent on visual reality. It was about the idea, going back to Gombrich. It's about the idea of what a holy person should be. So that's the western portal at Chartres in the 12th century, and I'm sure many of you have been there, an amazing cathedral. Next slide then, please. And this is to remind me that we're going to move on now into some more Byzantine art, which will then merge us into the early Renaissance. So we're going to look at some Byzantine art, and I know Mario will be very pleased that we're going to look at Neretzi in North Macedonia, and we're going to look at Maleševa in Serbia, and we'll look at also the Hagia Sophia, Istanbul, the great cathedral church of the Byzantine Empire, and then we'll come back to Ohrid to look at St. Clement in North Macedonia. So next slide then, please. So we're starting here with this delightful little monastery church, the Church of St. Panteleimon, 12th century in North Macedonia, just outside Skopje and Gorno-Neretzi. And this is quite a remarkable fresco. And it shows the beginning of what was termed, or what art historians have termed, the Byzantine Renaissance, which is Byzantine art becoming more naturalistic and full of emotion. Look at this lamentation. This is Christ taken down from a cross. There's Mary and John, and just look at the faces there. The emotion in Mary and in John, and the way the figures move. Now, there's still a lot of patterning. If you look at the physique of Jesus, the anatomy, and even the robes of John, that is a lot of pattern and stylization. But there's this wealth of emotion being brought in into the art, which we haven't seen perhaps before in the earlier Byzantine. If you think of the mosaic of Justinian, they were looking at us stonily, but without any real emotion. And I wanted to compare this, and I'm jumping periods now deliberately, but I wanted to compare this with the beginning of the Renaissance in Italy. And here we have a fresco by Giotto from the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, and it's a lamentation. And you see again the emotion, but here Giotto has crowded the scene, and he's dared to put people with their backs to us. So this is not in that same way hieratic, because we're observing a scene and we're not actually being engaged by that scene in the same way. If you look at the Nerezzi, they're still half looking at us. They've still got an eye to us. So there's an engagement there. Whereas this is much more naturalistic. We're observing something that is happening, full of emotion, where the bodies look real and the shapes look real. And even though there's some patterning, the patterning is beginning to disappear. This is the beginning of the Renaissance interest in the physical world in a way that the earlier medieval world had not been interested. Next slide, please. And two other, again, examples of how we're seeing the Byzantine Renaissance develop. On the right, we'll start here with the Hagia Sophia. Because the Hagia Sophia, the wonderful cathedral church of Constantinople, and after the establishment of the Turkish Republic, it became under Ataturk a museum. And you may have been sad to note that last year the President Erdogan turned it back into a mosque, which I think was a backward step. But they uncovered, when it became a museum, many mosaics that had been covered over, because in Islam, human representation is not allowed. So mosques are always plain, though calligraphy is allowed, not actual portraits or representations. So this is a representation of Christ in quite a stunning and a more naturalistic way than we've seen Christ before, and holding his Gospels. And you can compare it again with this wonderful angel, the so-called white angel from Milesheva, and he is showing, pointing to the empty tomb, to the Marys as they come on the day of resurrection to find Jesus. But look how plastic and molded and naturalistic this angel has become. Even the robes, though you can't see them terribly well, are falling much more naturalistic. And the face, he's looking at us with an emotion, not just stonily, but engaging with us in a way that earlier medieval art hadn't. Here you might say Jesus on the Hagia Sophia mosaic is still following us in a slightly distant way, observing us perhaps again as a supernatural being would. And here, of course, this is God observing us. So it has a different implication. Whereas the angel here, I think, is almost conveying a message. Look, the tomb's empty. Jesus has risen. And this wonderful figure dominating the fresco in the way it does. Next slide, please. And to follow this up, I want to make a comparison here between, again, two stories which are exactly the same. It is the Annunciation. And you can see on the left here, this is 14th century Annunciation by Simone Martini. And Martini is almost the last of the Gothic International artists. So he's still very stylized, very patterned, very detailed, very rich in the way that he conveys this scene. If you look, there is some emotion as Mary turns away, more almost in the body shape than in her face, which almost looks like a grimace. I don't want that news, thank you. And then almost beautiful angel, and the richness again of Martini's painting. I notice there's a spelling error in the legend. I apologize for that. And then over here on the right, an icon from St. Clement in Ohrid in North Macedonia. An amazing icon with here the archangel stepping forward with dramatic movement, his feet moving dramatically, and Mary not backing away in quite the same way Mary does in the Martini, but putting her hand up. Again, this not particularly good news, but of course it is good news, but she hasn't got the full implication of it. But notice she's sort of there is some perspective here where she's under a porch, and there's been an attempt to create some sense of depth. So the Renaissance, the Byzantine Renaissance, is influencing both in terms of the stylization, but also in the richness of the art. And we don't have enough documentation to know quite what is going on, but we know that, of course, after 1204, a lot of Byzantine art came through Venice into the West. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople and brought lots of treasures back to Venice, and they, of course, got into the Western world generally. So Byzantine art created that Byzantine influence seems to have, the Renaissance influence seems to have moved in. But of course, it wasn't the main influence of the Renaissance. The main influence of the Renaissance, that rebirth, is the rediscovery of the manuscripts which came from Constantinople, and the reading of those manuscripts, which then brought the classical world back into the medieval world, and of course then influenced the art to become much more naturalistic and seek to reproduce the art of antiquity. Next slide, please. I think, Kate, you may be striking. You've got that right. Yes. And of course, here, another example of Gothic International, the wonderful Wilton diptych, and Richard II, who of course has many associations with St. Albans, not good ones, because of course of the Peasants' Revolt and the execution of people in St. Albans for rebelling against him. That's another story. But here he is with the Virgin and Child the other side, this wonderful lapis lazuli blue, and all these angels' wings. It's amazing. And of course, Edward the Confessor and Edmund, a martyred king, killed by the Viking raids, and John the Baptist with the Lamb of God. And there he is. So Richard, this is a political piece, clearly. Richard associating himself closely with the Holy Family, with the saints, and in a pious position, praying. So the relationship there, quite clear, and a wonderful piece of international Gothic art. Next slide, please. And this is taking us into the Renaissance. The term first used, as you can see, by Michelet, Jules Michelet and Jacob Burckhardt in the 19th century. So the term the Renaissance is actually quite late, but the people involved in it, of course, were looking back at the ancient world, the classical world. We're going to look at a wonderful fresco by Masaccio in the Brancacci Chapel in Florence. We're going to look at also in Florence Donatello, the David, and we'll also look at Michelangelo's David, but we'll end there also looking at Leonardo. We'll end the Italian Renaissance with Leonardo da Vinci. What's going on? Very important things historically. Printing with the Gutenberg. We've got the Turks conquer Constantinople, which means more manuscripts, more ancient works are coming back into the West. Columbus lands in the New World, which opens up a whole new way of thinking. It's not just a physical discovery, it's a great mental discovery, increase of trade and so on. And of course, the Reformation starts with Martin Luther. So a lot of historical events tied into this. Next slide, please. And here's the Masaccio. This is the tribute money. It's a story about St. Peter. And the frescoes there are, Masaccio's frescoes are dedicated to St. Peter. Unfortunately, some of this fresco, particularly the background, was badly damaged in an 18th century fire. But the feeling and the way that Masaccio tackles this as a story is so lifelike and shows how far we've moved from the medieval frontal poses. Here, the story is that the tax man is demanding money. Peter is told by Jesus to go and find a fish and finds the money in the mouth of the fish, and he eventually pays it over. But look how he's daringly put this figure with his back to us, that Jesus, the perspective is beginning to work. So you feel you're actually in a scene. As I say, that we can't take for granted actually the background here because it was badly damaged. But look at this building here. He's trying to get perspective in. And in reality, the perspective lines are actually, you can draw them from Christ's face, from his eyes. They move across. So the rediscovery of perspective, if you like, from the ancient world, the idea of naturalism, of modeling in a way that hadn't happened before, and observing a narrative situation which has more elements of realism in them than they've had before. Next slide, please. And this also is conveyed in sculpture. Sculpture is rediscovered now. Hardly any sculpture in the Gothic period. There's some, but of course it's very associated with religion. Here we have on the left this extraordinary bronze from Donatello, the first naked male sculpture since the ancient world, because of course nudity was frowned upon by the early church and by the medieval church. But here Donatello, living in the Renaissance city, demanding a new form of antiquity, a way of looking that disappeared with the Greeks and Romans. And of course now the collecting of Greek and Roman sculptures and so on becomes a really important part in developing the Renaissance art. This is an extraordinary bronze. And an extraordinary pose, really, because it's almost quite effeminate in the way, and so luxurious in the way that David is posing. And of course, it's the story of David cutting off the head of Goliath, a biblical story. And next door to perhaps one of the most famous sculptures of all time, Michelangelo's massive, colossal David. I just put in the dimensions there in imperial measurements, 17 feet. I mean, that is an extraordinary size. And again, following the classical anatomy, very naturalistic, but a pose that's quite new. It wasn't taken from any medieval iconic poses before. This is a new one that Michelangelo has created himself, and an extraordinary sculpture, which heralds, in a sense, the height of the Renaissance. Of course, Michelangelo himself moves into the next stage, which art historians call mannerism. But this, I think, is very, very classical in the way he's portrayed David. And next slide, please. The ultimate, I guess, in terms of our understanding of Renaissance art, Leonardo da Vinci. On the right, a portrait which says it is a Leonardo da Vinci portrait of himself as an old man, though there is some question whether it is a real Leonardo or not. But it's the style is so much Leonardo. Again, crayon, a wonderful drawing of this face with realism This is an old man, everything etched into it, and I do hope it really is Leonardo, because it's how I like to think of Leonardo. And then, of course, his wonderful idealism in the way that he has created this portrait of a lady within the ermine. I mean, she's gazing, it's a real portrait, a real person holding this ermine with a sense of a pose that is so relaxed and yet at the same time is so holds us magnetically. It is a gaze of such power. And she looks away. Who is she looking at? What is she looking at? There's again some enigma, just in the way that the Mona Lisa, of course, is one of the most enigmatic portraits of all time. This is a very enigmatic pose. So here we are at the height of the Renaissance, the rediscovery of classicism, but also adding all those other elements that have been developed through the medieval period in terms of richness and pattern. Next slide, please. And now we're finally, the last bit, we're going to move up to the Northern Renaissance, to the areas of the Low Countries, and we're going to look at Peter Bruegel and finish with Jan van Eyck, just at the point when Copernicus is proving that the Earth is round, so the Bruegels were painting. And I'm going to take them not in chronological order, because I want to finish with Jan van Eyck. So if I could have the next one, please, Kate, thank you. Here's the Bruegel I wanted to show you. And you'll probably guessed why I wanted to show you this, because here it is, The Hunters in the Snow, in the museum in Vienna. And it's a story, it's an image of everyday life, something that's happening. These are not religious figures. These are not saints. They are not demanding anything from us. We're almost like a camera watching it, except, of course, it's filled with so many symbolic elements that it's not a camera. It's telling us all about the medieval life in the lowlands. It's showing us the hunters. You probably can't see this very well, but if you see it close up, there's a dead fox hanging there. There's people here with a fire preparing outside an inn, the meal, the snow around. It's if you like, it's a conglomeration of what you might see in a snow scene, but he's taken us away from that religious dimension. He's giving us a chance to see what the slice of life was like in the lowland at that period. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. And it's a slide that, of course, is in our National Gallery, and it's such an amazing picture. This is Jan van Eyck's Giovanni Arnolfini. And what is going on? Is this a wedding? Is it celebration of eternity? Is it engagement? What is happening here? And we are no longer just gazing at this. We are witnesses to something that is happening. This engages us and brings us in. And the artist is there as well. If we look at the detail on the right, this is the mirror from here. This tells us that Van Eyck painted it, and you can see the artist there. We've become part of the scene. We're engaged in it. We're witnesses to whatever is happening. Is it a marriage betrothal? Is it a marriage itself? As I say, is she pregnant? What is happening? And it's wonderful, of course, for art historians, because we have to completely explore this every time and find a new story. But look at the way he's painted it. The detail, which you can see in International Gothic, the lamp here, beautifully painted. The expression, and yet at the same time we've got depth, we've got light source, we've got figures, we've got robes, we've got even a little dog here, and domesticated the clogs, the slippers there on the side. So it's an amazing picture which engages us in so many different ways, and it takes us through really into the modern age, because art after this is never going to be quite the same. I think that's a suitable point for me to end on, and I look forward to then moving to our third part, when we have to look at the move from the Renaissance and the mannerisms right the way up to modern day. Before I completely sign off, I'm going to ask Kate to just put the last slide up, which is unashamedly a complete plug for the final talk, which will be in the autumn. Kate and I haven't decided yet on a date, but we'll be working on that. And if you're not fed up with the sound of my voice and you're interested in a bit of theology and philosophy, on the 9th of June, I'm going to be in conversation, an interview with Nina Vintner about free will. Does it really exist? And I will be referring, as the illustration suggests, to St. Augustine's theory of original sin, but also looking at Pelagius's idea of free will, and then how free will has, in a sense, been developed, and the ideas and the concepts down through the centuries, through Western philosophers, until we end up with modern neuroscientists and modern scientists who flatly deny the idea of free will existing at all. So that's for the future. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Kate.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Tim, for such a fascinating and comprehensive overview of a complex period, and with such stunning illustrative examples. It just makes me want to travel so badly and see all these beautiful places, which is even more frustrating at the moment. So looking forward to when that's possible. Yeah, I'd just like to invite everyone to take yourselves off mute so we can welcome Tim with a round of applause. Fantastic. So I think now we have some time for questions. So I would encourage everyone, if you have a question, please post it in the chat box. You can post it to me privately, or we can post it to the chat box for everyone to see. So we have another question that's come in just now for you, Tim. Isn't it now thought that Flemish art and the Northern Renaissance exerted influence on Italian art? So there's, rather than this influence of south to north, the kind of northern influence happening at the same time.
I think that's perfectly fair comment, point. I mean, I think we got so absorbed, didn't we, with the Italian Renaissance? We thought it was a font of everything, but actually the flows were going both ways. And of course, from the lowlands, from Holland and the Netherlands, as now the amount of trade that was moving back into the Mediterranean and of course into the New World and around changed that situation. So there was more influence than probably earlier art historians thought of what was happening in the north of Europe on the Mediterranean. So sometimes it's tricky to pin that down into specific examples, but it's clear that there was an interrelationship between the two. And of course, this was enhanced in some way with the controversies over religion and the Protestant movement and the Counter-Reformation and so on. So there was a lot more flow going on than I think perhaps, academics tend to like to pin things down and make it simple, because then they've got the answers, but they're often more complicated. And of course, art historians will go on looking for those influences. That's the nature of our study. We're trying to understand and explain what is happening. Brilliant. But I do agree with the point that was made.
Another question I've had is, so obviously this is part of this story is one of cross-cultural influence and sort of sharing of artistic styles across geographies. And I was wondering how does that happen, that kind of cross-cultural sharing? Is it quite a lot of this seems to be through war and sacking and invading armies and what's often left as ruins? Is that what's sort of taken in and incorporated into new styles?
Well, it's part of that. Yes, it's part of the way humans operate. I mean, you know, my background is in anthropology, so I'm always interested in what determines our behavior and we are very competitive animals, but we're also very cooperative animals. So we do this strange thing of competing, which of course is what has created Western civilization. It was the European states competing against each other, sometimes very viciously, and particularly in colonial wars or whatever. But also at the same time being able to cooperate and borrow things and learn styles. And you've always been able to adapt. And it particularly happens, of course, now with new technology. Someone invents something and it's around the world in 5 minutes. We latch on to those things. So in terms of influence, when something's fashionable, and fashion is a fascinating area in that way, because things move almost sort of secretly in the way that people develop those things. So the interaction is there. And you're right, of course, Europe was marching all over each other all the time. And even though England became more separated after Henry VIII because of the split with the Pope, even then, of course, England was reaching out to new parts of the world and getting influences from those. So those influences were coming back in. I mean, you could compare it. I mean, it's often, say, with modern art, you take someone like Picasso, where the influences from Africa and from East Asia are influencing his art and coming in. And so those influences are moving. And of course, in the 18th century, huge influences coming in from China in terms of the porcelain and the pottery and so on. So although we think of these national boundaries and we think of cultures being separate, they're always interacting. They're always interacting. So that influence is moving. And I suppose Gothic style is a very good example of that, in the sense the way it moves across and becomes adopted. And of course, you've got, my last point, you've got royal courts where there's intermarriage and exchange going on. And sometimes it doesn't always work very well. For Anne of Cleves, the portrait was a disaster.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. I was wondering if you could comment more on the Dutch primitives and the Dutch primitive style.
That's fascinating, isn't it? In terms of that, we tend to think of it again as why it's called primitive, which I think is a bit unkind in some ways, because primitive is often associated with being uncivilized in that sense. But it represents, I think, what the politics that's also going on in there. Because you have to remember that this was an absolute tinderbox with the Spanish control and the Protestant movement and so on. And so that rubbing up against those aspects, I think, made ordinary life really interesting, but also fantasy, of course. We have to think of people like Hieronymus Bosch and where they were going with some of their painting, which is quite extraordinary. So I think there's an emphasis there on imagination. And imagination had been slightly suppressed in the medieval period, because politically you didn't want your subjects to have too much imagination. And the anti-royal, the anti-establishment feelings that were generating, partly through the Protestant movement, but also just by what had been happening in terms of the conflicts, particularly after, well, I suppose you could say particularly after the Louis XIV and so on. You get this Europe, in some senses, looking for something new, and the imagination of particularly the Dutch painters is quite fantastic. Though I will in the next series, of course, have to, because he's one of my favorite artists, I will have to look at Vermeer. And Vermeer sort of takes imagination and then pulls it back into domesticity and ordinariness with the richness that is quite flabbergasting. So we're really looking forward to analysing Vermeer. As I say, he's one of my great artists. But to answer that question, yes, I think I hope I've answered it. It's the imagination within the primitives, which I think is really exciting. They're using imagination in a way that hadn't been used perhaps before. Certainly in the Italian Renaissance, it's much more about, in a sense, being eclectic and borrowing and refining. So you get this wonderful refined art based on the classical art. But in the North, you're getting something that's breaking away and more, as I say, I'll repeat myself, more imaginative.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. What triggered the shift back to the more naturalistic styles in the late Byzantine and then subsequently Italian Flemish Renaissance?
Well, this is interesting, because there's still quite a debate about which is going east and which is going west, and how you get that. And it starts really in the 11th century with the Comneni, the dynasty, the Byzantine dynasty, and they get this Renaissance. But they're opening up. And there was a period where Byzantium was so under pressure, mainly from Arab incursions and attacks, it withdrew on itself. It was inward looking. With the Comneni, it starts looking out, and you've got the Crusades, of course, coming, bringing Western ideas. So you've got the Byzantines having to see outside their theocratic state. I mean, it was a very theocratic state where they were very controlled and very autocratic in that sense. So they were being opened up to other influences. And I always think about this. There's this wonderful manuscript we have from Anna Komnena, the Alexiad. Anna Komnena is the daughter of the empress, and she meets the barbarians for the first time, and she meets the Crusaders, and she's absolutely overwhelmed. And you can see in her writing that they're both frightening, but also so totally, utterly intriguing. And she sort of gets grip to it. So the Byzantine world, I think, the reason for that Renaissance is it's opening up. And of course, I haven't mentioned, of course, you're getting the Serb kingdom developed, and it looks to Byzantium, but it's also separate, and it looks to the West as well. So, and there's actually quite a struggle going on between the Roman Catholic Christianity and the Orthodox Christianity for souls. They're fighting for souls right in what we now call the Balkans, in that area. And the Serb Empire's founded, and they're borrowing from Byzantium, but they're also looking to the West. So you've got quite an interchange of cultures going on.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Another question I had was actually thinking back to, let me check my notes, or the Renaissance style and the depiction of architecture. I can't quite find the name of the example you shared now, but the depiction of buildings there. And I'm sort of wondering how much sharing between disciplines was going on, between architecture, mathematics, geometry, to kind of create these beautiful styles and show those buildings in such exactitude and with such precision.
Well, that's a good question. It opens up that whole, which I didn't make as a point. Really, those early Renaissance, we know Leonardo is a polymath, but there's Brunelleschi, there's Ghiberti, they're interested in maths, they're interested in architecture, their knowledge and their interests are not limited to just decoration or painting or sculpture or what. They are polymaths, and they're using that to rediscover things like perspective, the vanishing point, the architecture, and how, the brilliant buildings they're able to put up. And it's this, this is always a fantastic fact that I love bringing out again. It wasn't until Michelangelo built the dome of St. Peter's that there was a dome ever the size of the Hagia Sophia, which was built back in the 6th century. You've got that huge gap because Romanesque architects and Gothic architects could not attempt to do that. They did not have they had the tradition of a building in a certain way, but they did not have the mathematics and the engineering skills that the Renaissance developed. So yours is a very good question, Kate. It's a pity in some ways. We sort of in the 19th century started to narrow ourselves down a bit and become specialists, and that became clear in the 20th century. And probably just because the sheer volume of what we had to know, but and certainly when I was going to school, science and arts didn't mix. They were separated, which I think was a great shame. But that was a sort of the grammar school norm, I suppose, as it was.
Thank you very much. Another question's come through. One thing I really noted was the sort of movement to naturalism and such emotive expressions. And I was just wondering about the kind of spiritual role of art, and whether, because I know in medieval times there's lots of stories about art coming alive and saints coming alive and tears rolling down their cheeks, and whether there is any kind of connection between that movement to naturalism and then that sort of spiritual role of art, or I'm not sure about that phrase.
Art has always sort of been magic, and you were either lucky or unlucky enough not to see my first session, because I was talking about cave paintings and the magic that we have to speculate, because our ancestors have not written anything down or been able to tell us. But the magic of cave painting, why were paintings in the back of caves where people couldn't get good access to them and so on? And there's always been, yes, this magic. And of course, in Byzantine art, the idea was with the icon, that the icon was a means of communication. It had the power to send you straight up to God. And it wasn't idolatry, as might have been portrayed in the Old Testament, that these were objects that you worshipped. You used that, the communication of the icon to reach. So there's always been this sense that art can have transcendental qualities. And you're quite right, there are icons that weep, and there are statues that bleed, and there's all those sort of magical elements which are bringing you closer to the the divine object. And it may, it's like the relic of St. Alban. We've got his shoulder blade. It's not that we worship that shoulder blade, but the shoulder blade in itself has a bit of contagious magic. By getting close to the shoulder blade, to the relic, we get close to the original. So it is, an art has all sorts of magical elements to it, even in terms of how people produce works of art, which aren't necessarily translatable. It's going to be interesting with artificial intelligence, isn't it? Is artificial intelligence going to be able to create that magic that a human being can do with reproducing something?
Yes, thank you very much. And I know with artificial intelligence, a computer has recently tried to create a painting, and it is absolutely terrifying. It's very alien and quite scary to look at. So I'm hoping that will stick to human artists at least for another few generations. Brilliant. I just wanted again to say a huge thank you for Tim